Alright guys, well if you've been sort of keeping up with some of the recent videos, we've been talking a little bit about using Pythagoras, and we use Pythagoras only when we've got right-angled triangles. In other words, triangles that have a 90-degree angle. Okay, so anything triangle that has a 90-degree angle in it, we call it a right-angled triangle. And when we do Pythagoras type questions, that's the kind of triangles that applies to. But there are other types of triangles. Not all triangles are right angled. So let's have a look at some of the other types of triangles that you might come across. Something like this one here. We call this an acute angle. Now you might remember from previous work that the word acute means less than 90 degrees. So an acute triangle has all three angles that are in fact less than 90 degrees. And if I have a look at this one, each one of those three angles is less than a 90-degree angle. It's smaller than 90 degrees. We call it an acute triangle. What about this one? Obtuse. It's pronounced obtuse. Well, if it's a triangle that has at least one angle that's more than 90 degrees. Okay, well, it can only have one angle. When I say at least, because it's impossible to have two angles in a triangle that are more than 90 degrees. But we'll get to that in another video as to why that's impossible. So an obtuse triangle has one angle that's more than 90 degrees. That would make the other two acute angles, less than 90 degrees. All right, what about an equilateral triangle? Well, let's take a look at some of these little symbols and explain what they mean. When you see these little single notch marks like this one, and this one, that means that all three sides are the same length. Now we do the same idea for angles. See how I've got a single line, a single curve here? That means that each of those angles are the same as each other. So an equilateral triangle has all three angles are equal to each other. In fact, they are all 60 degrees. So in an equilateral triangle, that would be 60, 60, and 60 degrees. And all three sides would also be the same length. What about an isosceles triangle? Well, have a look at these symbols. We know that these little single notch marks mean those two sides are the same length. We know these little two single curves mean that those two angles are the same amount. But a double line like this means it's different. Okay, it's still an angle, but it's not the same value as these. And that's what makes up an isosceles triangle. You have two angles that are identical. In that case, it's the ones here at the bottom. Two side lengths are the same. So these two sides are the same, but the others are different. That'll be a different length. That will be a different angle. We call that an isosceles triangle. The last one we're going to look at is called a scalene triangle. So let's see, from what we've just learned about these symbols, I'm looking at that thinking, wow, none of those are the same. That's a single, that's a double, that's a triple. So none of them are the same length. That's a single curve, that's a double curve, that's a triple curve. None of the angles are the same value. So a scalene triangle has all three sides and all three angles are different to each other. Now, just before we wrap up, you can have a triangle that fits more than one of these categories. For example, let's look at an equilateral triangle. I can see that as well as being equilateral, it's also an acute triangle because all three angles are less than 90 degrees, right? And that's what we said over here. An acute angle has all three angles less than 90 degrees. So this is also an acute triangle. What about this isosceles? Well, if I drew an isosceles triangle that looks something like this, I can see I've got an obtuse angle in here. So it can also be obtuse. Now this one was acute, all right? Each of these were less than 90 degrees, so it's an acute triangle. But if I've got a nice sort of flat one with one obtuse angle, it could also be an obtuse isosceles triangle. And lastly, if I look at scalene, if I did a scalene triangle that looked something sort of flat like this one, it's also obtuse. So the top one up here was acute. This is obtuse because of the obtuse angle, the angle that's more than 90 degrees. So I could have a scalene acute triangle, or I can have a scalene obtuse. So even though it's a scalene, it could also be one of these other categories. Not always, but just sometimes you get these ones that sort of double up. So hey guys, that's it. That's our quick kind of intro to the world of some of the different types of triangles. Now, if you're doing this in a class context, now's a great time to pause and just copy down everything you see on the screen and just get all those details down in your book ready to get on with some practice questions. Good job. Well done.